Evolution is the changing of alleles in a population over time. That's the allele frequency. A population of animals or plants can have evolution occur. Laws are things that always happen, and theories are things that explain the laws and can be used for predictions. When the ancient people looked at the earth, they had no idea, and they gave different definitions about how old the earth was, and they used different ways to determine. Quite often it was related to people from the past who had lived and written things from the past, so that would be kind of where things began. That means going back to the Sumerians and to the Babylonians, you had the kind of the origins of some of the ancient texts, and these ancient texts were copied and given to other people and talked about and re-talked about, kind of like a Chinese whispers, or what we call telephone. And we had this stuff finally written down, and written down into things that were then promoted, especially after the advent of the printing press. Spread very widely, but people didn't quite like this information because it was kind of obviously wrong. The earth couldn't have been that young. And it started that people were collecting more and more information about the age of the earth, and they determined that the earth was quite a bit older than what had been stated, and that was disputed by some because people have a vested interest in keeping things the way that they had them before. Well, that's fine, but later more and more information started coming up, and this age of the earth was determined to be older, and people started then looking and finding out more and more information. A guy named Lyell wrote a book about how the earth changed the surface, and once it was determined how the land could rise up very rapidly, it was understood how fossils could end up on tops of mountains, how sea animals could end up on tops of mountains, and so a lot more information started coming about. When that information started coming about, the age of the earth was determined to be much older than what it had been before. People then started looking more closely at the fossils, and sure enough, they found that if you look down at the lower layers of the fossils, you find that they are a little bit different from those on top quite often. Not always, but quite often they change as new ones come about, and then they can change very dramatically, and usually the dramatic changes are occurring after you have had great changes in the surface of the earth. And we learned from Lyell that the earth can change very rapidly, and it was observed after that to be happening. The fossils were seen to be slowly changing in the layers as you go higher and higher, until later on in the layers you find situations where some of the fossils are even hard to be identified as being from the same origin as those lower down. They started then looking at the different characteristics and trying to determine the relationships, and developed a method of determining how closely related things were. And by doing this, scientists, naturalists were able to determine that things do change over time, and dramatic earth events cause these changes to occur, and they create the environment for different traits that have evolved to be selected for. And that makes them evolve even more rapidly, or stay in the population even more rapidly than they did before, and so you have population changes. Now, those changes are not something that we would think of as happening quickly. A lot of our modern day creationists, they like to act like changes just occur overnight. In fact, when they talk about the changes in the fossil, the Cambrian explosion, they say, oh, look, that happened all at once. No, it didn't. And now we have lots of evidence that things were occurring, changes were occurring, and all these other things were happening long before that. But after the Cambrian, you had, from that point on, representatives of all of the modern phyla that we have today. They were present then. They weren't the same. And they had all kinds of things that were experimented with evolutionarily that went extinct, and what we have left today are the results of that slow choice by the environment. And of course, we still have changes occurring, and we're going to have a lot more occur because we're changing the climate of the earth, and we have already had a lot of it occur because we change everything with human intervention. So really, basically, evolution on the earth is occurring now due to humans. All of the things that are on the earth now, because we are affecting the entire planet. So you could say, oh, it's not occurring, that's just artificial, humans caused it. Yeah, well, all things are caused by changes in the environment. That is evolution. Evolution provides the selection for all of that. You have the genes that are there by mutations, and those are the ones that are either selected for or against. And they're selected for or against by the ones that reproduce. So the reproducing organisms that are able to have offspring that are able to have offspring, that's how evolution occurs, and very quickly you can change. So when you have a dramatic event, if you have something survive, then that surviving gene will be the gene that is the one that does the reproduction. We've already discussed this before. So very rapidly you will have a change in the alleles in the population. Evolution, but that rapidly may be millions of years because of the fossil records. And we know that the layers of the earth, another thing these young earth creationists do is they try to say, oh, look, there was a big lava flow, that's several layers there. No, that's one layer in the earth. It may be a thick layer at that point, but other places in the earth it will be very low, very thin. The KT boundary, where you had the asteroid hit that wiped out the dinosaurs, is a very thin layer all over the world. But it's thicker in some places than others because obviously more debris fell out of the atmosphere in some areas than it did in others, and you also had the big flow. So you can have flood areas that deposit more, you can have landslide areas that deposit more. That's still the same layer. The layers of the earth are the things that are found all over. And those layers can be millions and millions of years. Usually we determine a different era, a different time period, based upon the mass extinctions that occurred during that time period, and we are creating those extinctions now. So we're creating a new time period. This is how it worked, and as you find these different things occurring, they also started finding, and we find today, that there are mineral deposits that come out in those different layers, and we find that minerals that have come up in volcanic eruptions and things, they get together, they mineralize, they crystallize into their own elements. So if you have radioactive elements that crystallize, those radioactive elements will be in a crystal all the same thing. If you find years later that you find this crystal and you determine whether it is there and its decay product is there, and you can determine the different amounts of it and the decay product, from that you are able to determine how long ago this occurred, because you can look at the half-life. And the half-lives of these different radioactive materials have been determined. So they can identify very, very, very accurately when this occurred by when the volcanic eruptions are there and the layers that it's found in, and they can look at these different radioactive minerals and they can determine which one is there, how much its decay product is there, how long ago it occurred, by breaking it down to the half-life of that particular element and comparing it to the decay product that is left behind. They can do this with all kinds, and this is what they started doing after they started finding radioactive materials. Now, Marie Curie and her husband were very much involved in working with this stuff, and they of course gave their lives due to working with this kind of stuff. Well, she did for sure. He got killed in a car wreck, but he was also sick of radiation poisoning. But from this, the age of the earth was determined to be much, much older. In fact, we finally got to the point where we can determine that the earth is about 4.5 billion years old. Now, that age of the earth changed a lot over time, because each step was a step in learning more and more about it. First, they looked at the layers. Then they said, whoa, these layers took a long time to get here. Then they started looking at the fossils in the layers, and they said, hey, these fossils in this upper layer are a little bit different than those below. And then they started saying, wait a minute, that took a lot of time for that kind of change to occur. Then they would, each time, they would set the date, how long they thought it would take based upon the evidence that they had, and they could not determine accurately the age of the earth and the age of the layers in which these fossils were found until they were able to find the radioactive material. But what they could do, and what they still do, is look all over the world at the layers of the earth, and if they find specific fossils in those layers, then they know the age of that layer, because those fossils may be found in that layer, and some similar in a lower layer, and some different in a top layer, and they can look at the fossils that are found in specific layers, and they can determine the age of that layer. But if it gets to where there's any question about it, and there have been lots of questions, especially when they've been looking at human fossils or pre-human fossils in Africa, they just look at the minerals from the volcanic deposits, and they find out the minerals that have been laid down at the same time that those layers were laid down, at the same time the fossils were made, and quite often the fossils were made by the volcanic eruptions, when ash fell all over them. So they can determine the age of that particular layer of the earth, they can determine the age of the fossil, and they can do that with a lot of accuracy. And they can use many, many different minerals to do so, and this happens when things crystallize. It happens this way, so it's not something that is a questionable thing. It's not something that's hard to understand. It's only something that people want to manipulate and lie about. Ken Hovind, well, Ken Ham too. Ken Hovind and his son Eric are the biggest liars that you could find on this. They try to act like the Grand Canyon was all laid down in a week. It has rock, sandstone, different layers of calcium carbonate, rock of different types, volcanic layers, all these different ones. It's not layered by flood. It's layered by the age of the earth, and these layers can be determined by the minerals there. And when they lie to you and you believe it, you are falling into the trap that they want. They're nothing but religious used car salesmen taking advantage and trying to destroy humanity. And they're doing a good job. They are doing things that are preventing us from correcting the problems that are occurring in the world that need to be corrected, and they are preventing it, and they may cause the destruction of all of humanity with their foolishness. Don't follow the idiots.